Did you catch that headline? U.S. in panic. BRICS just crushed the U.S. dollar. Sounds like something from a high-stakes thriller, right?
Yeah, it's such an explosive statement. Like, what exactly are we looking at here?
So, we're looking at a bold claim that the BRICS coalition, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, is pushing a massive shift away from the U.S. dollar. It really sounds like de-dollarization is intensifying, and that has huge implications for global finance.
I'm hearing you. It's almost as if the dollar is on a slippery slope, right?
Exactly, and the headline suggests that the U.S. might be in a state of panic over this move. It's like the dollar is the pillar of global finance, and now BRICS are, challenging that dominance head on.
Yep, but isn't it kind of a dramatic oversimplification? I mean, I get that de-dollarization sounds thrilling, but do we really see immediate collapse, or is this more of a long-term shift?
Well, it's definitely a long-term trend, yet the rhetoric around it is, really incendiary. It's meant to capture attention. Think about it. If these countries, which together command a significant portion of global trade, stop relying on the U.S. dollar, the ripple effects could be massive.
Right, and it causes a kind of feedback loop in the international markets. I mean, if investors start doubting the dollar's dominance, that could, trigger a self-fulfilling prophecy, couldn't it?
Exactly. It's akin to a trust fall in a room full of strangers. If one person wavers, others might follow. It's like one investor's doubt propagates through global trade networks, and suddenly the faith in the dollar starts to crumble.
Absolutely, but don't you think we have to be careful? Sometimes headlines like this are designed to, incite panic rather than reflect the nuanced reality of slow economic evolution.
True. I mean, there's a lot of sensationalism in today's media. But still, the underlying shift, de-dollarization, is real. It's like, if you imagine a popular game where the rules are rewritten mid-play, that in itself creates uncertainty and excitement.
I see your point. But let's get into the mechanics. How exactly might the BRICS be crushing the dollar? Are they setting up alternative payment systems, or is it more of a symbolic rejection?
Well, it's a little bit of both. These countries are exploring alternative currencies for international settlements and, even creating mutual trade agreements that bypass the dollar. It's almost like they're building an alternative club that doesn't need the dollar as a membership card.
Yes, that's a good analogy, kind of like having an exclusive currency party where the dollar just isn't on the guest list.
Exactly. And this de-dollarization attempt could be seen as a direct challenge to the economic hegemony that the U.S. dollar has enjoyed for decades. And, with global power dynamics shifting, some countries see a strategic advantage in diversifying their reserves and trade currencies.
Diversification for stability, right? But then, isn't the dollar still pretty resilient? I mean, look around. Most global commodities, loans, and so much more continue to be priced in dollars.
That's a very valid concern. The dollar, still has a deeply entrenched network effect. However, even a gradual shift can have long-term consequences. It's like slowly peeling a layer off a big old apple. You don't notice it until a significant part has been removed.
Right. Small, incremental changes can accumulate and eventually, topple the system. But then, couldn't this be an overblown reaction? Some suggest that panic might be more of a media construct rather than an economic reality.
I get that perspective. Yet, it's important to note that economic confidence is a bit like confidence in a sports team. If you start losing faith, even if the core fundamentals are intact, you end up passing the ball to the opposition. That's essentially what happens when investors shift their reserves.
And when you think about it, the world economy is so interconnected that even a seed of doubt can spread like wildfire.
Absolutely. And taking a closer look, This move by BRICS is also like a statement of political solidarity. It's not just about economic calculations. It's about asserting greater global representation and, pushing back against perceived U.S. dominance.
Yeah, it's a power play with deep geopolitical undertones. It reminds me of historical shifts where emerging economies banded together for a fairer deal.
Exactly. It's reminiscent of the old multipolar world theories, an attempt to create like a new balance. And one interesting angle is that even if this movement doesn't immediately topple the dollar, it certainly puts the idea of a diversified global financial system on the table.
I agree, though I respectfully challenge, isn't it possible that the entire thing is more about positioning and signaling rather than immediate economic disruption? I mean, a shift in sentiment might be rapid in headlines, but actual structural change takes decades.
That's a fair point, indeed. It could be more of a gradual recalibration fueled by, strategic alliances and improved technologies for cross-border transactions. Still, those initial steps, like establishing alternative clearinghouses, can accelerate the process quicker than we're used to.
Absolutely, especially with the tech advancements and digital money emerging. It's like once the infrastructure is set, the momentum can build rapidly.
Exactly, and think about it. It's like building a new highway in the middle of a traffic jam. At first, it might just seem like a side road, but eventually, people start using it as a main route to avoid congestion. That's kind of what de-dollarization might look like.
Yeah, that's a vivid picture, using innovation to bypass an old system. But then there's also the question of trust. It will take time for the new alternatives to gain the same level of trust that the dollar has built.
Precisely, trust is like the glue of any currency system. And even if BRICS introduces alternatives, they have to prove they're as stable and accessible. It's like convincing someone to switch from a well-known brand to a new, untested one.
Right. And even though the idea is enticing, the reality of global trust networks is stubborn. We've seen this before. Countries flirt with alternatives, but often revert back once the experimental phase is over.
Exactly. It's a risky balancing act. And while we're discussing risks, I must point out that there's an inherent vulnerability in any system that attempts to undermine a long-standing standard. It could trigger unpredictable market reactions, sort of like testing a new ingredient in an old family recipe. You might end up with a delightful twist or a complete failure.
And sometimes these risks can have unintended consequences. I mean, it might also push the U.S. to recalibrate its monetary policies, which could in turn stabilize the dollar or even, create further volatility.
Right. It's a complex dance of confidence and policy adjustments. The U.S. might react with measures to reinforce the dollar's standing, like strategic interest rate changes or diplomatic efforts to maintain economic alliances.
Yeah, that makes total sense. It's almost like a high-stakes chess game where every move is met with a countermove, each side reading the other's intentions.
Exactly, and the dynamics here are ultra-involved. It's not as if the dollar can be toppled overnight, but the message here is clear. Global players are reconsidering the old order and pushing for something new.
And that honestly is what makes this whole discussion so fascinating. The idea that historical power structures can be reimagined in such a public and assertive way is both thrilling and a bit nerve-wracking.
Right, and it opens up questions about, the future of global finance. Will the dollar retain its dominant position, or are we witnessing the early stages of a more fragmented, multipolar currency landscape?
I get excited thinking about that future. It's like watching a new era of economic experimentation unfold right before our eyes.
Absolutely. And while we might debate the intensity of the panic or the immediacy of the change, one thing's for sure. This discussion reminds us that economic power is never static. It evolves, sometimes slowly, and sometimes with an earth-shattering jolt.
Yep. And it's a conversation that forces us to rethink old assumptions about currency and trust in the global economy. It's both daunting and inspiring at the same time.
Right. It's like the calm before a storm that could redefine the financial landscape. And while the media may use hyperbolic language, the underlying trends encourage us to keep an eye on how this power shift evolves.
Definitely. Well, whether we're in a state of panic or simply witnessing transformation, these moves by BRICS remind us that in the world of finance, change is the only constant.
Exactly. And as more innovative financial tools emerge and global partnerships shift, we're bound to see even more dramatic changes. It's an exciting time to be watching these developments, right?
Absolutely, and I suppose that's why these headlines, as sensational as they are, manage to strike such a chord with people all over the world.
Right. So whether you see it as a nail-biter or a slow burn, it definitely pushes us to ask important questions. Who holds the power and for how long? And what might the future hold for global currency systems?
It's a conversation with plenty of twists and turns, almost like uncovering a mystery that stretches across continents and eras.
Exactly. And as we wrap up, let's remember that while the immediate effects might be debated, the long-term implications of de-dollarization could eventually reshape how nations interact, trade, and trust each other's currencies.
Right, and it just goes to show that economic narratives are as dynamic and unpredictable as the global stage itself.
For sure. And thanks for diving into this with me. It's been a fascinating exploration of how a headline can open up a world of deeper economic and geopolitical debates.
Absolutely. It's been a wild ride. Talking about the potential crumbling of a financial giant, it really makes you think about where we're all headed.